you for being here this morning. My biggest concern this morning is that I don't suck. That what I have to say will be a benefit and value to you. If you're a coalition member, I want to thank you also for being here. And if you'll see me after the meeting, if you're a Westside Coalition member, I'd like to take your name down and make sure that we can get you some credit for your yearly attendance. If you haven't attended an annual meeting yet, we can get that done for you. In 2003, the Westside Coalition was formed in response to new regulations by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. And the San Joaquin Valley Drainage Authority and their member districts thought it best to form a coalition and invite their growers to be part of that coalition. And then they contracted Summers Engineering to manage the coalition. And specifically, I'm here today because I manage the day-to-day operations of the coalition. Very quickly, we're going to be covering three general topics that I believe will shed some light on the state of the local watershed that many of you farm in this morning. We're going to review some historical monitoring data that relates to the local watershed. We're going to consider the impacts of two historically widely used chemicals that have already been mentioned in the San Joaquin River Delta. And then we're going to discuss some regulatory water requirements, or excuse me, some water quality regulatory requirements that have relevance to many of you here today in this building. And then finally, we'll try to answer any questions you might have about the material I'm presenting this morning. And for brevity's sake, if it's possible, if you could just jot your note down, and at the end of this presentation, we'll answer any questions. But if you feel something is really, really relevant and important, please just lift your hand and we'd like to take that question. But I really want to keep the presentation moving, and then at the end we'll answer any questions that you may have. First, the Westside Coalition covers the irrigated lands west of the San Joaquin River, from basically Mendota on the south to Wesley on the north. And the coalition was formed to help Westside growers comply with the regulatory requirements of the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program, and also the San Joaquin River Chlorpyrifos and Diazonine Total Maximum Daily Load Program. And among a host of other things, the coalition is tasked with managing the water quality data that's generated through the coalition's monitoring program, and then the reporting requirements related to the two programs I just mentioned. And something that I'd like to just kind of posit with you this morning is, historically, growers have always been regulated. Farmers in this area in the state of California have been regulated, especially since the Clean Water Act in the mid-1960s was formed. The new regulations that we're going to talk about today really aren't new regulations. It's just a reinterpretation and a tightening of existing monitoring and reporting regulations that have always been involved with growers. I'd like to show you this morning a boundary map of the Westside Coalition. It illustrates the general location of the coalition service area. It's bound on this kind of purple, and my colorblind eyes, that's purple. I'm not sure exactly what that is. Maybe it's red to you. Is it purple?
Yes.
Okay, I'm doing good. All right. And then it's hard to see, but these spots here that are kind of highlighting yellow, those are monitoring stations that we once a month go and we monitor water. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this is the grasslands bypass area, the drainage area, and there's a new coalition just been formed in the grasslands drainage area. And if you haven't heard of that yet and you farm in the grasslands drainage area, please see me this morning also. We need to get you signed up. And also drawing your attention to the fact that this boundary goes all the way up into the coast range there. But our focus really is on the about 460,000 acres that are on the valley floor that are being irrigated for ag purposes. The coalition, as I had mentioned, is assisted in its efforts by local water and irrigation districts in our service area. And this is very important because the districts are able to communicate coalition news and information very efficiently, expeditiously to their growers, and they provide staff help in certain situations. They give us access to facilities and equipment that they have. Sometimes when we're doing a larger venue meeting, they'll provide staff and equipment to help us facilitate that meeting, and I'm really grateful this morning for all the support we received from the water and irrigation districts. We talked about this morning that we do monitoring and reporting. We're testing for pesticides. There's a general chemistry suite or panel that's also being tested. There's aquatic toxicity and sediment toxicity. Mainly they have different creatures that are in the water column and in the sediment floor. They put the water with the creature and see if the creature lives and thrives, or if it dies, and then based on how many die, how quickly, as to how toxic the water may be or not be. And so during any given year, the coalition, we monitor every month. We have 21 sites. We monitored all 21 sites, and we try to catch 2 rain events in months when rainwater is present. We have 2 sampling crews, one in the north, one in the south. They take field readings of several constituents. They collect about 12 gallons of water at every site that they go to, and we split that between 3 different laboratories. One lab does general water chemistry, another does pesticide analysis, the third lab then performs the aquatic and the sediment toxicity tests. You say, well, why are you telling us this? I'd like to point to the fact that it costs about $2,400 per site per month. If we're hitting 21 sites, it's about $50,000 a month. That equates to $600,000 a year. That money comes from coalition growers, farmers. And it's one of the largest impacts in our area financially that occurs. So it's very important that we do this. But I want you to understand that it's very important that you recognize that we're doing that monitoring on your behalf. If the coalition wasn't doing this monitoring, if you were to go to the regional board and engage them personally, then you would be doing this on your own. You would be spending the $2,400 per site for your farming area, depending on how many sites you had, and you would be doing the monitoring. And though it's very expensive to run the entire coalition and all the monitoring, we think it's a real, I don't want to say deal for you, because it's not a deal, it still costs you money, but we think it's more economical in the long run to have this coalition type effort. Let's look this morning at some monitoring results of some of the constituents of concern. You'll notice up there that we have the chlorpyrifos and the diazinon that are real big constituents of concern in the San Joaquin River tributaries and the San Joaquin River main stem itself. And these show that some constituents of concern with the coalition that we've gathered over the last 3 years. 3 years is a very important number. We'll explain that here in a little bit. But the purpose of this slide this morning is to demonstrate that we have been making some headway with pesticide exceedances. And you'll begin to see that some of these numbers, though they're not linear at this point, but from 2013 to 2015, we've had reductions in these issues that are of big concern. And it's a demonstration that we are making headway, that the growers are taking this more seriously, that you're doing all the things necessary to try to protect the water quality in our basin and our areas here. And there is a definite trend downwards over the last 3 years. But as you can see the numbers this morning, and we'll explain a little bit more as we get into this, there still remains a lot of work that has to be done yet to get those exceedance numbers down to 0. Just like we've got 0 in some of these areas here, every one of those numbers needs to be 0. That's the target. That's what the regional board has mandated, that we as a coalition managing this, and then you as a grower as part of the coalition, that it's your responsibility, our responsibility to help you to get these numbers to all be 0. Now let's look also at these same constituents over the last 3 years. And these 5 areas here, they would represent what we call the salt sluice sub-watershed. And many of you will be growing in that sub-watershed. San Luis Canal Company, Tranquility Irrigation District, though it doesn't impact, TID doesn't impact it very much. But it's this kind of southeastern portion of our coalition where these monitoring stations are at. And then you can see for the last 7 years, or excuse me, the last 3 years, the kinds of exceedances we've had. Now these are not detections, these are exceedances. There's a water quality number, it's a written number, a target number, and we're detecting these pesticides, and these tests are being run on these different creatures, and they're exceeding the value that the Water Quality Control Board says can be allowed. And so we call those exceedances. The significance this morning of that is, and especially this 3-year issue, is that the Regional Water Quality Control Board says that more than one exceedance in a 3-year period, or so two exceedances in a 3-year period for any one of these constituents, and there are over 50 more pesticides we test for. Any 2 exceedances in a 3-year period triggers a focused watershed plan. And if you're in our coalition, you'll begin to get information from us more. You'll begin to interact with us more because of these focused management plans that are in this area. It's very important that we follow through with you, we follow up with you, because again, we've got to get these numbers down to 0. This is it's kind of hard to see in the slide, and I apologize. I should have considered maybe different colors to highlight it better. But this whole area here bounded is what we call the Salt Slough Focused Management Plan area. It's a sub-watershed. It's not all the Salt Slough area. Munslough's in here, but it's representative of those 5 sites that I showed you. Let me get my page turned here, I'm sorry. And based on the data that I've shown you and we viewed, the Salt Slough sub-watershed is currently under a mandated focused management plan for pesticides and aquatic toxicity. Now, for you farming on a day-to-day basis and interaction with the coalition, the focused watershed plan really doesn't involve you too much, other than part of the focused management plan is to try to find best management practices that will protect the water quality. And so we do surveys, and you guys have been filling out surveys for us and sitting those back. We're analyzing those. We're going to put together numbers of people who are doing certain practices in your area. We're trying to identify, if somebody's using a flood irrigation, is there something they could do to try to hold the water on their property longer, and to keep that pesticide, keep that sediment, to keep that trapped on your farm where it doesn't get into the watershed and doesn't end up in the San Joaquin River. And so we're focused, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, Though they're not listed, the focused management plan, as we said, we've got chlorpyrifos and its derivatives here. We've got diuron, and there's aquatic toxicity that are on this focused plan that we're looking at very closely. But also, the management plan includes metals, arsenic and boron. There's pH and DO, EC and E. coli that have also been exceeded in your watershed, or in this watershed. Now, we understand that most of those are second-tier constituents, that we term them that way. And while they've been technically been exceedances, most likely agriculture isn't always the culprit in this. And if you'll, well, I don't have it on the slide here, but say boron. Boron occurs naturally. It comes out when we're pumping groundwater. We're getting these kinds of metals coming up with the groundwater. There's not a whole lot you can do, but I just wanted to get your mind, try to wrap around this thing, that it's a big deal. That the state, even though they understand boron isn't something that you may be pouring on the ground as some kind of an amendment to your soil or something, they understand it's most likely naturally occurring, but they've said we as a coalition have to demonstrate why agriculture is not part of the problem. So those are one of the hurdles that we face. It's a big, daunting task for us. It's up to us to determine, or up to us to try to find, where the sources of these constituents are. Now this next slide this morning, it illustrates the desired outcome of the Coalition's monitoring program. Remember, as we've already said, 2 exceedances of a single constituent in any 3-year period results in a management plan for that sub-watershed, for that constituent. And so we've highlighted the zeros. I look at all the monitoring data that comes through, I analyze it, And I love to see these, we call them non-detects on our lab reports. I love that. And a non-detect ends up being a 0 in these slots here. And I like to see that. And well, I don't want to get ahead of myself here and kind of blow the ending of my presentation. But again, we like to see these zeros. They're real important. And if we're ever going to retire a management plan, if I can get a constituent not to show up for 3 years, then we can apply it and say, look, we think we've got the chlorpyrifos issue solved. We think we've got the EC or whatever it might be. We think we've got this solved, and we'd like to retire this. We apply for that, and we're able then to retire these constituents out of these focused management plans, which in the end saves money for everybody.
Before you go on,
yes.
Could you just briefly mention what sediment tox is? What are you specifically looking for in the sediment?
The sediment toxicity is they test the water, the sediment, excuse me, that we get out of the bottom of a creek bed or a drain or something, and they put it in they put a creature, a Hylela azteca. It's a sand-dwelling creature, microscopic. They put it in the sediment, and then they let it sit for so many days, and they look at it under a microscope. They begin to count the colony, begin to count the numbers. They give it food, they feed it, and if it doesn't die off, then there's some, or if it dies off in certain numbers, most likely they do, because not everything will live, even though it's a good test perhaps. But the idea is to see if the sediment has chemicals attached to it. And unfortunately, the chemical that we all love to use because it's readily available, it works really great, chlorpyrifos, amen, bonds to the soil. And so when we see sediment going down a drain, we see that chocolate milk colored water, and we test for that creature, we're pretty sure that it's going to die in the sediment. And chlorpyrifos, when we find out what was in the sediment, is going to be the constituent of concern that we're going to find.
Could I ask something that you might find interesting is, with a show of hands, ask how many people in the last 3 years have used malathion, diuron, or diazinon. You will find that interesting. I haven't used those in many, many years, personally. Maybe some other guys do.
Diazinon, diuron, and malathion. He asked, how many are using that by show of hands? We've got some.
Very little, though.
Yeah. Of course, this isn't representative, this group here. We have no idea if this is representative of growers across this entire watershed. And we understand that those chemicals are being used less and less and less. But guess what happens when malathion no longer shows up, or diuron or diazinon? Its counterpart begins to show up in the watershed. It begins to be found. And so the idea is not just simply quit using diuron and use something else. The idea is manage the pesticide that you're using to hold it on your property and don't let it escape. Pete, did that answer your question?
Yeah, but it added some confusion. I've always associated the sediment toxicity with a pyrethroid and more the water solubility with chlorpyrifos. And so that's just kind of what I was wondering. Is specifically, because I've heard that the problem is we switched from the organophosphates to more of the pyrethroids, that we didn't realize that they were adhering to the sediments and actually getting into the bay and the rest of it. So I'm just curious. I understand it's a general bioassay,
yeah.
And you're not specifically looking for a active ingredient, but
well, we do actually. If it meets the criteria of less than or 20% or more of the creature dies, we have to do a targeted identification examination,
okay.
TIE. The TIE, then we do a chemical analysis or pesticide analysis. Chlorpyrifos, bifenthrin, S-fenvalerate, and there's a fourth one that always shows up in the sediment.
okay.
It's always there. Thank you for your question. Appreciate it. Now we can see here that we've got some ones here. These aren't so bad. And I don't want to just come and just hound you and harass you over the chemicals you're using. I want to demonstrate that I think we're making headway. We've got some good things going on. In 2008, and I didn't want to bore you with a lot of data that is meaningless today, but in 2008, those numbers would have been in the teens. Everything there would have been highly toxic. There would have been detections and exceedances all over the spectrum, because in 2008, we came in with focused management plans. We talked with the growers, we sent them information, we met with them, we emailed them, we called them, we had them in meetings, and now we're seeing those numbers have come down dramatically. The curve is a beautiful looking curve, and we'll talk about the problem that we're encountering in just a moment, but we are making headway, and we're doing some pretty good things here. And I'd like to show you this next slide here. These are the things that aren't so good. That because of these numbers, we've got these focused management plans. And I'd like to say that because we've come down from a high, I think in 2008, I want to say, in this watershed, there was 15 or 16 detections in 2008 of chlorpyrifos, and now we've got it down to 7. You know, I'd like to tell the regional board, well, look, we've done our due diligence, we've done good, and we're doing okay. But they say until that number is 0, then we haven't done what we need to do. The growers haven't done what they need to do. And so there's this work that's got to be done. And I'm here to tell you today, not to scare you, not to throw something at you, but that if we can't get these numbers down dramatically more in the next 3 to 5 years, because the regional board has the regulatory authority, they're going to re-regulate. That they've already told us that we have 5 years from 2014, so 2019, they're going to look at this program. And they've told us in no uncertain terms that if we haven't fixed things for the better, then they're going to do something different. They haven't said what that is, but in looking over regulation, my best guess is they're going to ask us to start doing more targeted monitoring. In other words, we're going to show up at the edge of your field, and we're going to take water samples. We're going to find out when you schedule irrigation. And you release water, and we're going to find out when pesticides are being applied, and we're going to be required to be out there to take that, so they can find out where the chemicals are coming from. And something I've discovered that's unique, and it's a phenomenon, I suppose, is that in a group like this, or bigger groups, you know, no one will fess to maybe that was me. And I don't know, and we don't know. We have no way of knowing who's putting a pesticide on in a illogical way or in a manner that's not protective of water quality. But because we detect it, someone is. Now we're trying to make sure that ag either is or isn't the culprit. We're trying to make sure that we are not, you know, haranguing you and harassing you for something you're not doing. Other people do use this. I recognize that. I know the state of California, they use diuron. They go along the sides of the roads, they spray chemicals. It gets in the water. We understand that, and we're constantly with the regional board trying to get them to understand that farmers aren't the only ones using pesticides. If you farm in a community area near residential areas, I realize residents are applying these chemicals in numbers that are probably at hazardous levels. I've been guilty of that early on in my life, not understanding that because it said put this much, if I put twice as much, it's twice as good. Not understanding that. I do now, and I regulate myself. But again, this is to illustrate that we've got some work that has to be done to curb these exceedances. Now, another function of the coalition is to administer the Total Maximum Daily Load Program, or more commonly known as the TMDL program. And in conjunction with another coalition on the east side of the river, we monitor several points on the San Joaquin River for chlorpyrifos and diazonon. And to your credit, it's not turning up in our areas. It's not showing up very much. We had a detection about a year ago. It was a J. Luckily, we reanalyzed the water. We felt there was an issue with maybe our laboratory. They did something wrong. We hired a professional, a PhD, who understands these things, a scientist, to interact with our labs, who did, and we were able to get the detection in the San Joaquin River. It was at the Patterson pumps, to get it reduced to what we call a J flag value. In other words, it's detected, but the spectrograph they're using, or the machine they're using to see how much is in there, it couldn't quite It doesn't know how much. It just knows it was there. And there's not enough material for it to give it a really good quantity, a real good value. And so a J flag is almost like a non-detect. Not completely, but it doesn't count against the TMDL program. And you can see here the blue bar represents chlorpyrifos, the darker bar, the gold bar here, it represents diazinon. And you can see there's a definite curve. We talked about that 2008 threshold when our management plans came into being. You can see that this is trending down, then it's leveled off. Diazinon down here, we didn't detect it in 2012, or excuse me, 2013, 2014, or 2015. But we can see that the chlorpyrifos has trended up. And that's the thing, that since 2008, we've got this curve going down, but over the last 3 years, we've seen all pesticide detections for all constituents trending back up. And we're hoping that's an anomaly. We're hoping that this is something that will just correct itself. Here in 2015, there are no detections for chlorpyrifos. We think that's very positive. It's probably in response to the notice of intent that's now required with chlorpyrifos to use, that people have quit using it, perhaps. And I'm hoping next year's data is the same, that this just is an anomaly, a one-time deal, but that we've got some real good trend going with that. Now the issue with chlorpyrifos and diazinon in the San Joaquin River is the TMDL program came into being because the water system in California is circulatory, that it keeps coming back, especially in our valley. Water is pumped out of the delta, it goes down into our growers down south and from north to south, and then it's put back in drains in some areas, goes back in the San Joaquin River, and it ends up back in the delta. And it's come to a point where they can detect the chlorpyrifos and diazinon in the complete water cycle. That it starts somewhere, it just finds its way around, and then municipalities, local water districts who are using water for drinking purposes were discovering it more and more in their water column as they're purifying their water to drink to Title 22 regulations. And so it became a real legislative deal. It became a real political issue. And it should be. We don't want to be drinking chlorpyrifos. It's not good for you. It's deadly in large quantities. But nonetheless, this TMDL program came into being because of that. And so there's a total load that can go in the river in any one day. It's a very complex, or more complex than I want to get into here, formula to determine the amount of diazinon and chlorpyrifos that can be in the river at any one time. But again, this slide demonstrates that we've made headway, we've done good. It's not showing up in the river, but it's showing up, chlorpyrifos is still showing up in the tributaries to the river. And that's the problem, because if it's in the tributary, it can make its way back to the San Joaquin River. When it's detected in the San Joaquin River, there are more people than just the Regional Water Quality Control Board that look at those numbers. It's a statewide issue. There are statewide groups. There are regulatory groups. There are environmental groups. There are environmental justice groups that scrutinize this information. And when those chemicals show up in the river, it creates a big political thing, and then more pressure is put on the grower because it's in the San Joaquin River. So we've got to keep it out of the tributaries as well. And in fact, the good doctor this morning it reminded me that all these chemicals need to stay on your side of the fence. You're really not permitted to let them go outside your fence. It's got to stay on your property and be something that you have to deal with. Now, if we can kind of shift gears this morning, I want to talk a little bit about the grower interaction with our coalition. Beginning in 2014, there were new water quality regulations that were instituted for the growers in the entire Central Valley, not just in your community, not just in your area where you farm, but all the way from Redding to Bakersfield. It's called Region 5 of the Regional Water Quality Control Board. A general order was given, several general orders depending on where you grow at. localities, but it's essentially the same order. Everyone's doing the same documentation, the same information. You've been doing farm evaluation plans. You've been doing nitrogen management plans. Some of you were really lucky, and you got to do the sediment and erosion control plan. The groundwater monitoring and the reporting requirements in 2014 were added to the existing irrigated lands regulatory program, and they were in response, direct response to political activism that generated political and legislative action in Sacramento because of nitrates in the groundwater. And this is why today the program has been accelerated. It's been implemented at a much more intense level, is mainly because of nitrates in the groundwater. It's the driving force for this regulation. And so this new regulation, it requires the growers in the Central Valley to be more proactive with the water quality issues as it relates to their farming operations. And so you're going to be required, and are being required, to be more interactive, to provide more information, to provide more documentation and data from your farming operations. And as the years progress, you're going to see more and more as dealing with nitrate or dealing with nitrogen fertilizer. Oh, it's not me, I'm sorry. Does anyone in here, have you been doing the nitrogen management plan? Anyone? Some? Yeah, okay, you're familiar with it. It's got to be certified in the whole deal. But what I'm saying is this is the driving force of these new regulations, or the tightening up of the old regulations. And it requires more grower involvement. I'd like to also, if I could this morning, talk about some of the coalition responsibilities. And the idea is to try to get you to understand this morning that the coalition is not the regulator. We're not the ones regulating you. Is that you are the regulated. I'm not the regulator, the state is, but you're the folks being regulated. The coalition is here to try to help you conform to these regulations. That if you didn't deal with the coalition, if you weren't involved with the coalition, you would be dealing with the state of California, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, directly. And so we take a lead role in many issues on behalf of the growers. We conduct education and outreach, like we are doing today, to inform growers of requirements and ways to protect water quality. We conduct regional monitoring. We've prepared a comprehensive groundwater assessment report. We report to the regional board results of the monitoring programs. We provide summary reports of those forms you send us, farm evaluations and nitrogen summaries. And currently the coalition is in collaboration with other coalitions in the Central Valley, and we're preparing to launch the Management Practice Effectiveness Program. And that's a big word, a way of saying, is that we're required to try to find out what the nitrogen removed for any crop that we grow in the Central Valley, what that value is. There are a couple of crops, almonds being one, that we have pretty good values. Processed tomatoes in our valley, they have good values. Maybe walnuts is one that's coming up to speed. But we've got to find out the 60 or 70 crops that are growing in our area, how much nitrogen is removed from the field when you harvest the crop. And so what that gives you then is how much remained on the soil, how much remains in the plant matter left behind, those kinds of things. It's going to be a very important issue. It's going to be a big, big deal. And you're going to become experts on all this nitrogen stuff, more so than ever before. Or you're going to hire somebody or get somebody in your operation trained up in these nitrogen issues, because it's like this steamroller coming at you. And I apologize for using that word, but I can't describe it better. It's a steamroller based on these nitrate issues in groundwater that are being focused at us. And so not only are we going to try to find and remove from every crop in your fields, but we're also supposed to do it for every soil type. So it's a huge, huge endeavor. And unfortunately, it's a costly endeavor. But really, in the end, you're going to want us to do this because you don't want to be lumped up. If you're growing almonds, you don't want to be lumped up with somebody who's up north growing almonds up in real loamy or real sandy soil. and they're just pouring the nitrogen down there, and it's soaking into the ground, and you're down here in these clay soils, and you know you're really miserly with the nitrogen because you don't need it to go past the root zone so much, and so we have to do it for all these soil types. It'll be to your benefit. These are some new reporting requirements, and we recently provided a groundwater assessment report for the entire coalition area. We received approval of this by the regional board, and it started a time clock, and that's where the forms come in and the deadlines for the forms that you've been getting and filling out so diligently for us. But the GAR, or the groundwater assessment report, it identified high vulnerability areas with the potential to discharge nitrates to groundwater. And the question I get is, you say, well, look, I'm judicious with nitrogen. I realize that everybody is. They're trying to be, because it's an input. It's a dollar value, and you're trying to reduce the cost in the farm. We get that. We understand that. But nonetheless, the nitrate is there, and the state says we have to do something about it. We've got to, and their idea is so much, well, it's there already. It's going to be really hard to fix what's already there. But if we can stop it from getting worse, and that's what this program is about, is to try to educate growers on how much nitrogen is being used. That's what the nitrogen management plan is all about, so that you understand that here's what that crop needs. We think at the beginning of the year, you make a plan. This is how much I plan to put on, and then at the end of the year, you go back and give us the actuals, what you actually did. Again, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on the nitrogen plan. That really isn't my main purpose to be here this morning. But I want you to understand that this groundwater assessment report identified high vulnerable areas. And if you got the nitrogen management plan, you didn't get it because somebody thinks or somebody reported that you're using nitrogen in values that are too high. It had nothing to do with what your operation is doing today. It had to do with the fact that you're on a certain kind of soil, you're in a certain area. You're in an area that may have had a groundwater well that's already been tested in a vicinity that was high in nitrate, and you were identified that way. Not because somebody said you did it, it's just simply because you're farming in an area where it's known to occur, or because of soil and hydrogeology, it can occur. And so again, I wanted you to understand that it wasn't because of what you're doing or how you're doing something today, it's just simply because of the geography and the hydrogeology underneath your land. And so this next map here this morning, I'm coming to a conclusion here. Appreciate your attention. These darker areas here, and I apologize that we don't have a better map to give you, but because the coalition is so big, we need to have something as large as this building so you could dial down to see your piece of property. But you can see that down here in these areas here where we're kind of focusing today, there's not a lot of groundwater assessment going on, or the assessment report didn't show a lot of vulnerability, but there is some in this area. As you can see that it's really kind of more up in these general areas west and north of our location here today. Again, because we don't have a real high resolution to show you, I just wanted to give you an idea of kind of at a lower resolution look at where these general areas are at. Now, I've kind of said all these things this morning to bring you to this particular moment here. Let's finalize this morning. Let's finish with some new requirements for growers. That the previously mentioned focused management plans, because of that, if you farm in that salt slough area, then you automatically had to do the farm evaluation plan because you were high vulnerable for surface water. The high vulnerable areas for surface water were determined by the pesticide monitoring and the other monitoring we've been doing for all those other constituents. The groundwater assessment report, it places the affected parcels that were on that map I showed you. It lays that over the surface water map also, and it places you in a high vulnerable designation for groundwater. And again, it's not because of how you farm today, it's not because someone's reported, it's just simply a study was done, the hydrogeology was looked at, soils were looked at, you put it all together, and your parcel may have lain in one of those areas. The coalition also recently was required to produce a report of soils the sedimentation and erosion. That demonstrated based on soil types and slope and the erodibility of certain soils. It placed you perhaps in that high vulnerable area for sediment and erosion. And again, it's not because somebody said you're throwing sediment in your tailwater off your property. Quite the opposite. Just simply, we wiped all the parcels off the map. We did our study. We laid the high vulnerable areas on the map, and we brought your parcels, laid it back over. And if you touched it in there at a certain percentage, then you were picked, unfortunately. And so based on these reports and these studies we've been talking about, and these high vulnerable designations that have come out of these reports and studies, a parcel may belong to some grower who are required to provide an annual farm evaluation survey, an annual nitrogen management plan, which has to be certified in several different ways, and you may have also had to do the nitrogen management plan, or excuse me, you'll have to do the nitrogen use summary also if you had to do the nitrogen management plan. And then some growers are also required to produce a sediment and erosion control plan. And again, I hate to throw all this information at you in a 45-minute slot. I know it's a lot, it's a lot to kind of process. But if there's one thing I could just try to sum up this morning, I'm here to help you. I know when some of you have called me, you talk with me, and I understand you could be irate. I can understand you're upset that you're having to do these things. I can't make the regulation go away. You can't make the regulation go away. Our legislators are the ones who are putting this to us. And so we have to comply with the law. You have to comply with the law. I'm here to help you to comply with those regulations and with the law. And so our overall purpose this morning of the coalition is to help growers implement management practices that are protective of surface and groundwater quality. Well, look, if that concludes my portion of this morning. Are there any questions real quick? Sir?
Can you say anything about the seasonality of those detections? The different, they tend to all be at the same time, or different ones at some times of the year?
This gentleman has asked about the seasonality of the detections. Yes, in fact, we can predict when certain chemical is going to show up.